The courtroom felt colder than the winter air outside. Emily Carter sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her fingers wrapped around a worn photograph of her late husband, Daniel. The picture had been taken on a summer afternoon 5 years earlier. Daniel was smiling, his arm around her shoulders, both of them standing proudly in front of the home they had worked so hard to buy together. Now that home was the reason she was sitting in court. 3 months had passed since Daniel's sudden death in a car accident. 3 months of grief, sleepless nights, and endless paperwork. But the pain of losing her husband was nothing compared to what followed. His mother, Margaret Carter, had wasted no time. For years, Margaret had treated Emily as if she were an outsider. She never believed Emily was worthy of her son. At family dinners, she disguised insults as jokes. At holidays, she made sure Emily felt unwelcome. Daniel always stood beside his wife, refusing to let his mother's bitterness damage their marriage. But after Daniel died, there was nobody left to protect Emily. Margaret immediately challenged the ownership of the family home. She claimed the property belonged to the Carter family and insisted Emily had no right to keep it. What followed was a brutal legal battle that drained Emily emotionally and financially. Friends stopped calling. Some relatives chose Margaret's side. Others simply stayed silent. Emily learned how quickly people disappeared when money and property became involved. Across the courtroom, Margaret sat confidently beside her attorney. She wore a designer suit and expensive jewelry. Anyone watching would think she was attending a business meeting rather than a court hearing involving her own son's widow. A small smile rested on her lips, the kind of smile people wear when they believe victory is already theirs. The judge reviewed the final documents before looking toward Emily. "Mrs. Carter," he said, adjusting his glasses, "have you reviewed this agreement with your attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand its contents?" Emily nodded. "I do." The clerk placed the stack of papers in front of her. The room became silent. Emily stared at the documents. Memories flooded her mind, painting the living room with Daniel, planting flowers in the backyard, spending evenings on the porch discussing their future. Every page represented the loss of something precious. Margaret leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the moment. She expected tears. She expected resistance. Most of all, she expected defeat. Instead, Emily calmly picked up the pen, one signature, then another. Page after page, the sound of the pen moving across paper seemed unusually loud. When she finished, she slid the documents back toward the clerk. For a moment nobody spoke, then Margaret laughed. The sharp sound echoed through the courtroom. "Well," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I suppose reality finally caught up with you." Several relatives sitting behind her smiled. One even shook his head, as if Emily deserved what was happening. Margaret looked directly at her. "You should have accepted this months ago. It would have saved everyone time." Emily slowly stood and gathered her purse. She looked exhausted, but there was something unusual in her expression. She wasn't angry. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even sad. She looked calm. That calmness unsettled Margaret. "You seem surprisingly comfortable for someone who just signed away her house," Margaret said. Emily paused, then she looked straight into her mother-in-law's eyes. A small smile appeared on her face. "My husband taught me many things," she said softly. Margaret crossed her arms. "And what is that supposed to mean?" Emily's smile widened slightly. "Never sign anything without reading every page attached to it." For the briefest moment, confusion flashed across Margaret's face. Then she laughed again. She thought it was a meaningless comment, a desperate attempt to save face. What Margaret didn't know was that the documents she had been so eager to obtain contained a hidden attachment, one she had never bothered to read. And that single mistake was about to change everything. The moment the court hearing ended, Margaret Carter felt unstoppable. She walked out of the courthouse with her attorney and several family members surrounding her like she had just won a championship. Everyone congratulated her. Some praised her determination. Others claimed she had protected the Carter family legacy. Margaret enjoyed every second of it. For months, she had fought to take control of the house that Emily and Daniel once shared. Now it finally belonged to her, or so she believed. That evening, Margaret hosted a small celebration at a local restaurant. Glasses were raised, toasts were made, family members laughed while discussing what Emily would do next. "She'll probably move into a tiny apartment," one relative joked. Another laughed. "At least now she'll stop pretending she's part of the Carter family." Margaret smiled proudly. For the first time in years, she felt completely victorious. Meanwhile, across town, Emily sat alone in a quiet office. The office belonged to Robert Harrison, the attorney who had been Daniel's trusted friend for more than 20 years. Stacks of documents covered his desk. Robert carefully reviewed several papers before looking up at Emily. "Everything has been filed," he said. Emily nodded. "Has she noticed?" Robert couldn't help smiling. Not yet. For months, Emily had endured humiliation and accusations. But shortly after Daniel's death, she discovered something shocking while organizing his personal files. Daniel had anticipated his mother's greed. Years earlier, after witnessing Margaret manipulate other family members during inheritance disputes, he had quietly taken steps to protect his wife. One particular property document contained a special legal provision. If ownership of the family home was ever transferred voluntarily through court settlement, all financial responsibilities connected to the property would automatically transfer to the new owner. Most people would never think twice about such details. Daniel had, and Margaret never bothered reading beyond the first few pages. The beautiful house she fought so desperately to obtain carried hidden burdens. The roof required major repairs. The foundation had structural damage. Several years of deferred maintenance had created enormous future expenses. There were also tax obligations attached to the property that would soon become due. Daniel knew about all of it. Margaret did not. "What happens now?" Emily asked quietly. Robert leaned back. "Now we wait." A week later, Margaret officially received ownership documents. She moved into the house almost immediately. Walking through the front door felt like claiming a trophy. She proudly showed the property to relatives and boasted about her victory. For a few days, everything seemed perfect. Then the first letter arrived. It contained estimates for emergency foundation repairs. Margaret frowned. The numbers were much higher than expected. 2 days later, another notice arrived. Property tax obligations. Then came a report from a structural engineer, then maintenance assessments, then contractor estimates. The pile of paperwork grew larger each day. At first, Margaret assumed it was a mistake. She contacted her attorney. She demanded explanations. She insisted someone had misled her. But after several days of investigation, the truth became impossible to deny. Every obligation was legal. Every responsibility belonged to the property's new owner, her. The same woman who had laughed in court now sat speechless at her kitchen table. Thousands of dollars in costs stared back at her from every page. For the first time, she remembered Emily's final words. "Never sign anything without reading every page attached to it." A chill ran through her body. Suddenly, the victory she had celebrated so proudly no longer felt like a victory at all. And the worst discovery was still waiting for her. Margaret Carter barely slept. For 2 weeks, official notices, contractor reports, and financial statements continued arriving at the house. Every morning brought another envelope. Every envelope brought another problem. The foundation repairs alone would cost tens of thousands of dollars. The aging roof needed replacement. The plumbing system had serious issues. Property taxes were due sooner than expected. The house she had fought so hard to obtain was becoming a financial nightmare. Sitting at the dining room table one evening, Margaret spread the documents across the surface. Her hands trembled as she calculated the numbers again. The total was staggering. "This can't be right," she whispered. The next morning, she met with her attorney. "There must be a way out of this," she said sharply. "Emily tricked me." Her attorney adjusted his glasses and reviewed the paperwork one more time. "No, Margaret, everything was disclosed." "What do you mean disclosed?" "The attachment was included in the court documents." Margaret's face paled. The attachment, the pages outlining all responsibilities connected to the property. For several seconds she remained silent. Then she remembered the stack of papers, the pages she had ignored, the signatures she rushed through because she was too eager to win. A terrible realization settled over her. Nobody had deceived her. She had deceived herself. Her greed had blinded her. Meanwhile, Emily's life was slowly improving. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. She had moved into a comfortable townhouse and focused on rebuilding her future. One afternoon, Robert Harrison invited her to his office. When she arrived, he handed her several folders. "I think it's time you saw these." Emily opened the first file. Inside were documents related to Daniel's investments. Her eyes widened. "Daniel never told me about these." Robert smiled sadly. "He wanted to surprise you one day. Years earlier, Daniel had purchased shares in several successful businesses. He had also invested in commercial property that generated steady income. Unlike the family home, those assets were protected under a separate trust. Margaret had been so focused on taking the house that she never investigated anything else. She assumed the home was Daniel's most valuable possession. She was wrong. The investment portfolio was worth several times more. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. Even after his death, Daniel had found a way to protect her. "He really thought of everything," she whispered. Robert nodded. "He loved you very much." As weeks passed, word of Margaret's financial troubles began spreading through the family. The same relatives who once celebrated her courtroom victory grew noticeably quieter. Some stopped returning her calls. Others avoided discussing the property altogether. The situation became even worse when people learned about Daniel's investments. Suddenly, everyone realized Emily hadn't lost anything important. In fact, she had quietly inherited the most valuable part of Daniel's estate. One evening, Margaret attended a family gathering expecting sympathy. Instead, she overheard relatives whispering nearby. She should have left Emily alone. Daniel planned everything. Margaret got exactly what she wanted. The words felt like knives. For the first time, nobody was blaming Emily. They were blaming her. Margaret returned home angry, embarrassed, and exhausted. Standing alone in the living room, she looked around at the house she once considered a prize. Now it felt more like a prison built from her own choices. The victory she had celebrated in court was turning into public humiliation, and deep down, she knew the truth. Emily had never defeated her, her own greed had. But the final lesson, and the sweetest part of Emily's revenge, was still yet to come. 6 months later, the house that Margaret Carter had fought so fiercely to obtain no longer felt like a victory. It felt like a burden. Every repair uncovered another problem. Every bill seemed larger than the last. The savings she had spent years building were disappearing faster than she ever imagined possible. The stress showed on her face. Friends noticed, relatives noticed, even Margaret noticed when she looked in the mirror. The confident woman who had laughed in the courtroom was gone. In her place stood someone exhausted by regret. What hurt even more was the silence. The family members who had cheered her on during the legal battle were nowhere to be found. The relatives who once praised her determination stopped answering her calls. The people who encouraged her fight against Emily had quietly moved on with their lives. Margaret was left alone with the consequences. One rainy afternoon, she sat in the living room reviewing another contractor estimate when she saw a newspaper article featuring Emily. Curious, she began reading. The article described how Emily had used part of Daniel's investment portfolio to launch a community housing project for widows and single parents. The project was already helping dozens of families find affordable housing. A photograph accompanied the story. Emily stood smiling in front of a newly renovated building. She looked happy, not because she had won, not because Margaret had lost, but because she had finally moved forward. For a long moment, Margaret stared at the picture. Then she lowered the newspaper. A painful truth settled into her heart. Emily had never been the enemy. The bitterness, jealousy, and pride Margaret carried for years had created the conflict. Daniel had loved Emily. Everyone knew it, yet Margaret spent years trying to prove she wasn't good enough, and in the end she had only hurt herself. Several weeks later, Margaret made a decision she never thought she would make. She called Emily. When Emily answered, there was a brief silence. "Hello, Margaret." Hearing kindness in Emily's voice made the conversation even harder. "I was wondering if we could meet," Margaret said quietly. The following afternoon, they met at a small cafe. Margaret looked nervous. Emily remained polite but cautious. After ordering coffee, neither woman spoke for several moments. Finally, Margaret took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." Emily listened silently. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I blamed you for things that were never your fault. I spent years trying to push you away. After Daniel died, I let my anger and pride control me." Her voice trembled. "And when I took the house, I thought I had won something." Emily said nothing. "There isn't a day that passes where I don't regret it." For a moment, Emily looked down at her coffee. Then she remembered Daniel, the man who always believed that kindness was stronger than revenge. When she looked back up, her expression softened. "I forgave you a long time ago." Margaret blinked in surprise. "You did?" Emily nodded. "Carrying anger only keeps old wounds alive." Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. The weight she had carried for months suddenly felt lighter. As they left the cafe, Emily paused outside. Across the street stood one of the housing projects she had recently completed. Families were moving in. Children were laughing. New beginnings were everywhere. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt truly at peace. Margaret had taken a house, but she could never take Daniel's love, his wisdom, or the future he had carefully protected for his wife. Standing beneath the afternoon sun, Emily smiled. The sweetest revenge had never been making Margaret suffer. It was building a beautiful life after everyone expected her to fail. And that was a victory no one could ever take away.